Okay, class. So for our next lesson, we're going to see how Mill applies the distinction we talked about last time between secondary principles and the utility principle to a question that's come up before in relation to Kant, which is, can the laws or rules of ethics ever have exceptions? Are there ever times when a rule of ethics says something is wrong, but it's okay to do it anyway? Or the rules of ethics say that an action is right, and yet it's wrong to do it anyway? And we'll see how Mill answers this, and this we'll talk about that last quote on the Mill sheet, which is his way of addressing this worry. But to begin with, let's take it back to Kant. If you remember, Kant thought that there could never be exceptions to the rules of ethics. He thought if something really is a rational rule of ethics, it must be absolutely universal, meaning applying in exactly the same way to every single rational creature forever, without any possibilities of exceptions. Right? And Kant, in fact, brought up the concern that many people have that there might be justified exceptions. And this is one of those things that really incensed Kant. And he thought, no, there really can't be any exceptions to these things. And in fact, if you remember, for Kant, making an exception for yourself, doing something that you can will to do, but you couldn't will it to be universal law, that for him was the formula for moral wrongdoing. Right? And in fact, he thought that's what bad people want to do, is make an exception. Right? They want to make an exception for themselves. They want to say, yeah, okay, in general, it's not okay to steal, but I'm going to take this bag of chips, right? In general, it's not okay to cheat, but I'm going to cheat, right? And we talked about, especially in relation to his first formulation test, the idea of making an exception versus following a rule without exceptions is exactly the way to tell whether you're ethical or not. So for Kant, his answer is absolutely not. There could never be justified exceptions. Mill, in contrast, thinks, yes, there can be exceptions to ethical rules, specifically these secondary rules that we talked about before. And he thinks it's due to the fact that life is so complicated that there'd be no way of formulating a rule that would always be right to follow, right? Or formulating a rule that it would never be okay to break. And we see this in the first line of that last quote. He says, "It's not the fault of any creed, but of the complicated nature of human affairs, that rules of conduct cannot be so framed as to require no exceptions, and that hardly any kind of action can be safely laid down as either always obligatory or always condemnable." So he thinks, first of all, life is complicated. It's not the fault of ethics or ethicists. It's not the fault of any given ethical theory that it has exceptions to it. That's just life. Life is complicated. And what life allows us to do is give general rules, but not absolute rules. And here you might think back, there's a kind of analogous case here to what Aristotle says about ethics when he says, look, don't expect more precision in ethics than the field allows. Life is complicated, and what we have to settle for a rough general sketch, right? Not precise rules. Aristotle thought, precisely because he's in agreement with Mill that life is too complicated to put in the form of absolute unbreakable rules. And so Mill thinks that, yeah, there could be possible cases where a rule of ethics can be set aside, right? And he thinks, think of any given action, right? Actions that you think are normally wrong, lying, stealing, killing. He thinks, yeah, those are, for the most part, almost always wrong. But there's going to be some cases where they might be acceptable. Some cases where they might even be good, right? If I'm killing somebody out of self-defense or to defend my family, right, for example, right, that could be a justified exception to the rule against killing. Okay, so Mill very much believes that there could be these possible exceptions. Let's look at some other examples. One of which that some of you have brought up already in class is, what about stealing to feed your starving family? Right, your family is starving. Can you go to the store and take stuff without paying because you can't afford it and otherwise they'll die? Kant would say, absolutely not. If there is a law against stealing, right, if that fails the categorical imperative test, it does not matter what the consequences are. That rule against stealing is in place no matter what. And if you break it, you're certainly free to break it, but now you're doing something morally wrong. Even if you're saving a large family of people and you're only stealing, say, $1 worth of food, Kant would say if that fails the categorical comparative test, if it goes against the rules of ethics, it's always wrong. In contrast, Mill thinks, no, this is a case where that rule against stealing can be set aside, right? That this would be a case where it would make sense to say that somebody who stole to save their starving family has not committed any moral wrongdoing. Let's look at another case that we talked about extensively in Kant, and that is lying to a murderer seeking his victim. And we talked about the typical scenario there is the Nazi guard who's knocking at your door, you're harboring Jews in your attic, right? Can you lie to that Nazi guard, right? Or do you have to tell the truth? We saw Kant gave what many people take to be a kind of outlandish answer that no, there's a rule against lying, and it fails the categorical imperative test. And so even if people have to die, that doesn't matter. You still have to obey this rule. And there are no justified exceptions to the rule against lying. In contrast, Mill thinks, of course you should lie to the murderer seeking his victim. And in fact, it seems like Mill had not read Kant's little tract on the supposed right to lie, because what he actually says is, no ethical thinker in history has ever implied that you should tell the truth to a murderer seeking his victim. Right? We know that's not true. Kant does think that, right? But Mill thinks, no, this is an obvious one. Of course you should lie to the murderer seeking his victim, right? This is clearly a justified exception to that rule against lying, okay? So then the next question that comes up is, what justifies these exceptions, and how do you know, right? Because Mill, like Kant, is worried about people who make an exception of themselves, people who claim to be above the ethical law or something like that. Right? And Mill knows that if you're going to allow these exceptions, you need to have some sort of objective mechanism for telling whether this is a case where an exception should be made or not. You can't just rely on people saying, well, I feel like I'm the exception here, or this situation is the exception. Right? But Mill uses this distinction that he's made between secondary principles and the utility principle to explain exactly what would justify an exception to an ethical rule, and how any person can know whether the situation they're in justifies such an exception. Right? And the idea is, let's take it back to the examples we talked about. Why is it okay to steal to save your starving family? Mill would say the answer is obvious to everyone. It has to do with the consequences of that action or refraining from it. Right? If I steal to save my starving family, the net consequences of that are going to be a huge increase in happiness, right? I've saved these people from dying. Or another way of thinking of it is the consequences of me obeying the rule against stealing and a bunch of people died, right? That's going to cause them pain and their family pain, etc. So he thinks it has to do with the consequences. Same thing with murder, the murderer. Why should you lie to the murderer seeking his victim? Mill thinks the answer is obvious. It has to do with the consequences. The consequences of telling the truth to that Nazi guard is going to be that many people die, and that's going to greatly increase the net suffering of the world, right? And in contrast, the consequence of me lying to the Nazi guard, right, assuming I save the family, is that those people will be saved from that pain, right? So in other words, if you can read between the lines here, you see what he's getting at is, it's the utility principle itself, its considerations of utility, of pain and pleasure, that are going to do the work of being able to objectively tell whether a law of ethics can be set aside or not. So in the case of stealing to save my starving family, all I need to do is say, look, yeah, that is a secondary principle. I shouldn't steal. But I know that secondary principle is based on the utility principle, right? I know the reason why I shouldn't steal is that in general, stealing decreases net utility, makes people unhappy overall. But I can apply the utility principle to this case and say, well, look, in this case, though, what is the net impact of me stealing to save my starving family? And I can clearly see that utility is going to go up. And because utility goes up, the utility principle is satisfied, and therefore I know I can set aside or break or make an exception of this rule against stealing. Do you see that? So it's true these secondary principles are based in general on the utility principle, but if I'm ever in doubt as to whether I should follow one of these secondary principles against lying, stealing, cheating, killing, etc., I can simply revert back to the utility principle. In a sense, I can go back to being an act utilitarian, and I can say, what is the effect of this action, right? And just as we said before, when I go through that utility calculus correctly, I do so objectively, right? So I'm not allowed to say, well, this is my family, right? And I only care about my family, right? I have to consider my own happiness and my family's happiness equal to everybody else's. But if I run through that utility principle test correctly and objectively, I will see that stealing to save my starving family increases net utility, and therefore that is a right action, right? And in fact, perhaps somewhat bizarrely, let's suppose I refuse to steal and my family starves. Mill would say, apply the utility principle there, and you've seen that action, even though you followed the secondary principle against stealing, your action was immoral. It was wrong because it resulted in a net decrease in happiness, right, or pleasure, or a net increase in pain and unhappiness. Same thing with the case of the Nazi Guard. It is the utility principle that shows us that it is the right thing to do to lie to that Nazi Guard. Because when I put it through the utility principle test, I see that telling the truth to the Nazi Guard would greatly decrease net happiness, and lying would greatly increase net happiness, right? And thereby, I've put forward an objective test, and I've seen objectively that it is the correct thing for me to do to set aside this rule against lying. Do you see that? So it's not a matter of me making an exception of myself in the way that Kant worries about, where I only care about myself, right? And out of pure self-interest, I'm doing whatever I want. Ethics be damned. No, Mill thinks this is a correct and objective way of telling whether you should set aside ethical rules, right? And in this case, if you run it through the utility principle test, you see that that rule should be broken in order to save lives and increase net utility. Okay, so for your reflection, I want you to answer if you agree on the broad question here of, do rules of ethics have exceptions or not? Are you more in agreement with Mill that rules of ethics have justified exceptions in certain rare cases, or do you agree more with Kant that they never can? And then the next thing I want you to ask is Mill correct to say that the utility principle itself is the kind of thing that will always give you the correct answer as to whether you are justified in breaking one of these secondary rules, things like not lying, cheating, stealing, etc.? Do you agree with Mill's solution in that regard?